Hi, I'm Isaac and I've been using the Hollyland Mars M1 Monitor for the last 2 months for both paid client work and YouTube video production. It's not a perfect monitor, but it's a great option if you're looking for a 5-inch monitor that has an inbuilt transmitter and receiver. In this video, we'll cover the pros and cons, we'll do a latency test using a couple of different configurations, and then I'll give you my final conclusion with recommendations. The biggest pro to me is value. So aside from being a great quality screen in a strong, well-built case, it also includes some accessories in the box like this D-tap to barrel cable, as well as a screen protector and a couple of other little bits and pieces. Now this might sound like a small thing, but for every other monitor I've ever purchased, I've had to buy one of these cables and a screen protector separately, and it just adds on to the cost. So it's really nice that they're included in this package. Next is the versatility. So you can use this in 3 different modes. First would be just as a monitor, like I've got it set up here. So this allows you to see what you're shooting a lot better than the crappy internal screen on my FX3. I use it this way, honestly, about 70% of the time. The second mode would be using this as a monitor/transmitter. Now there's 2 ways you might use this. One would be if you're the camera operator and you've got the client or somebody else monitoring. So I'll often use this when I'm shooting client work. I'll give them a monitor and they can watch as I'm shooting, especially for fashion. They might notice that a logo or there's a wrinkle in the shirt or something like that that I might have overlooked. But with them looking at it, they can say, hey, no, we need to shoot that again right away. So it gives me this peace of mind that whatever I'm shooting, I both think it looks good enough and the client has also sort of signed off on it as they're monitoring and seeing it as we go. It's also exciting for them because they get to feel more involved even if they're not providing any feedback. The second way to use this as a transmitter is if I'm shooting with my main FX6 and I've got this on my B camera, which is being operated by another shooter. This means I can shoot the main camera angle and I can also see what the second camera person's shooting at all times. So I can give them a bit of feedback if the shot that they are getting is too similar to mine, and it just gives me a peace of mind that we're getting 2 angles and perfect coverage on every scene we're shooting. The third way you could use this is as a monitor/receiver. This means you'd mount it somewhere off camera and have a transmitter mounted on a camera, and you can see everything the camera's recording from this little monitor. Now this works perfectly when I tested it. However, I'm never going to use it this way because this is only a 5-inch monitor, and if I'm going to have a remote viewing station, I want at least a 7-inch monitor or maybe a 32 or 55-inch TV so I can really see what's going on. I don't want to have to walk up super close to this, but that's just my personal preference, and it works perfectly as a receiver if you are wanting to use it for that. I also love the image quality of this monitor, and I'm not talking about the specs like how many nits it is or what the resolution is. It just looks great. Now what I love about this is it's both accurate and looks good. So I really need that accuracy so I can check that my white balance is correct and what I'm shooting is actually in focus. But it's also really nice that it looks so good with a nice contrast ratio, so that if a client's looking over my shoulder or I'm reviewing the footage with them, they're really impressed with what they're seeing, even though it's actually just a great monitor rather than great footage half the time. We laid out 5 different monitors and I was really trying to capture the differences between them on camera, but I was having trouble doing it. So I invited my friend Daniel around so we could just give a 20-second summary of how all the monitors look. However, we waffled on for way too long and it seemed like there was a lot of good information in there. So I actually already posted that as a separate video rather than making it a segment of this video. But the short version is, compared to the Shogun Inferno or the SmallHD Focus 5, the image quality is way better and everything looks really nice on it. Compared to the 702 Touch, the SmallHD Focus 7 and the Atomos Shinobi, they're all in the ballpark same area when nothing jumps out as being way better. There's just small differences in image quality that you might notice if you compare them side by side. You can check out my video with Daniel to see an in-depth comparison of the image quality of all of these monitors. Another thing I love about this monitor is the build quality. This feels super strong and rugged. There's no flexing or wobbling or anything like that. It feels over-engineered if anything, and feels like the kind of thing that if I was to accidentally drop, it would probably survive. I'm definitely not going to test that, but it feels really good mounting on the rig even without a cage. Another thing I love is the user interface. So it's super responsive to all taps, which is something I really appreciate. So the SmallHD monitors have that, but on the Atomos Shinobi, sometimes you tap something and it'd take a second to pop up and occasionally it would miss taps. Not so with this monitor. The touch targets are a little bit bigger, so it's easier for your big fat finger to get in there, and it just always works and responds instantly, which is a really nice experience. Another thing I appreciate is this has both DC in and DC out. So you can see I'm powering this monitor by a barrel cable plugged into it here, into the DC input. But I've also got a DC output here. So if I wanted to attach something else, like maybe a LED video light, instead of having to run a separate battery just to power that, I can run power out of here directly into light and then run everything off this one battery here, which is amazing. The final thing I love about this monitor is how easy it is to pair. Now, obviously if you're using this with one receiver and that's your whole setup, you'd only ever have to do this once, so no big deal. However, I'm using the Hollyland Mars 400 Pro transmitter and receiver, which I've been using for the last year or two, and they're a really great setup. It's actually what I'm using right now. I've got an FX6 here with a transmitter on top, and then just out of camera, I've got the receiver here with a 7-inch SmallHD monitor. That means I can monitor everything. I make sure my exposure is correct, I'm in focus, my audio levels are fine, and it just gives me a lot more confidence to do everything that I'm doing. So over the last couple of months, I've had to repair 20 to 50 times as I'm swapping between the FX6 transmitting with a transmitter and the FX3 transmitting with this monitor itself. Every time I've just gone to repair to the receiver on both devices, takes about 10 seconds of pressing through the menus on both things, and then there's another 10-second wait as they pair, and it's always worked perfectly. All of this, I can just turn it all off once it's paired, turn it back on, and everything's back where it was. So for example, for this video, I took a 10-minute break. I just turned off the camera, turned off the receiver, everything's off, saving power. When I come back, I just turn everything back on, everything works. I don't need to join Wi-Fi networks, open up apps on my iPad. It's just right there where I left it, and that's why I really appreciate hardware video transmitters and receivers rather than just having a transmitter and using a receiver app on an iPad or an iPhone. And now for the cons. So the two biggest cons to me are both related to latency. First is the image latency. Now I noticed as soon as I turned this on for the first time that what I was seeing on the monitor itself was slightly behind what I was filming. Now I had never experienced this before, as all my SmallHD monitors just show you exactly what you're seeing at the exact same time the internal monitor is recording. However, with this, there appears to be a 2-frame delay when you're shooting at 25 frames a second. So what I'm seeing here is slightly behind what I'm actually recording. Now it's not a deal breaker for me, and I'm now using this monitor full time on my FX3, so it's obviously not bothering me that much. However, it is something to be aware of if you're doing super fast-paced motion or if it's something you're highly sensitive to. The second con is the startup latency. So this means when I turn this monitor on, it takes a lot longer to boot up and get ready to go than my SmallHD monitors. Now this isn't a deal breaker again, because when I'm shooting, I'll usually just turn the camera on, turn the monitor on at the start of the shoot, and just leave it on. That way, even if I put it down for 2 minutes and then something magical happens, I can quickly just pick up the camera and start recording. I don't need to turn on the camera, turn on the monitor, all that kind of thing. The next con is something I also mentioned in the pros, and that's the user interface. So I love how fast and responsive it is, and it has all the tools I need. However, it doesn't have the same customizability as like my SmallHD monitors. For example, if you want to shoot with a grid overlay, you can turn grid overlay on and off here, but all you're getting is a 2x2 grid. You can't choose how many vertical or horizontal rows or the opacity of those lines. So for example, if you wanted to leave the lines on permanently to help you stay horizontally balanced, but you didn't want them overpowering the image, you could turn that down to 10% or something like that on a SmallHD monitor. On the M1, you get 2 vertical and horizontal white lines at 100% opacity or nothing at all. However, this is a new product and the software is constantly evolving. When I first got this monitor, I updated the firmware immediately and I had anamorphic support, which some of the early reviews mentioned as a missing feature. And I was able to de-squeeze perfectly as I'm shooting with my anamorphic lenses. So over time, this might be something Hollyland addresses with firmware updates, but realistically it's a nitpick and it's not enough to stop me from using this monitor all the time when I'm shooting with my FX3. The next con is the noisy fan built into this monitor. So when I first turned it on, the fan started spinning up right away and it was just making a little bit of noise. Nothing that would distract talent or anything like that, but if I had an on-camera shotgun microphone, I think it would have picked up some of the noise from this monitor. However, I went into the menu options and turned that off right away, and I've been using it for the last 2 months with the fan turned off, and so far I haven't noticed any negative side effects from having the fan turned off. I've done hours and hours of corporate jobs, I've done a whole bunch of YouTube videos, and everything's worked perfectly and silently, which really matters to me. If I do experience any issues in future because of the fan being turned off, I'll definitely leave a comment below and pin that, so check down in the comments section. But so far, after 2 months, it's been perfect on silent mode. Another downside of this monitor is the power consumption. So Hollyland rates this at 15 watts, which is 3 times higher than the Atomos Shinobi, which is a similar size screen. Now, part of that is because it is transmitting a wireless signal at all times. So I contacted Hollyland and asked if there's a way I can put this in monitor only mode where it's not transmitting any signals to try and save some power, but they said that's not an option. It's always transmitting or it's always receiving. So if you want to use this as an on-camera monitor, you have to put it in transmit mode. So that means my power draw compared to a Shinobi with similar size and image quality repeatability is roughly 3 times higher. That means with an NPF 750, I'll get 2 to 2.5 hours of battery life, and with a smaller NPF battery, I'd maybe get an hour, and with a big, huge mama, I'd probably get up to 4 hours of battery life from this. Obviously, you get a lot more with a dedicated monitor like a Shinobi that isn't permanently transmitting, but for me, it's not a problem as most shoots are only 2 hours anyway, or I can just chuck a bigger battery in the back or do a battery swap halfway, but it's definitely a con. My final complaint, which isn't really fair in a 5-inch monitor review, would be I'd love to see larger sizes of this monitor. I'd love a 7-inch size that I can just mount on my FX6 permanently, and then I can transmit without needing to put the Hollyland transmitter on my camera and using a separate 7-inch monitor. That'd really simplify my setup. I'd also love something in the 10 to 20-inch size that I can mount on a light stand, take a V-mount battery, and just have an all-in-one receiver monitor with all the tools I need, and I can just set that up on shoots. Because I like using this 7-inch monitor off camera, but I'd really love something a little bit bigger that's all-in-one like this, rather than my current contraption that's a receiver mounted to a monitor. Obviously, this isn't a valid complaint if you're looking for a 5-inch on-camera monitor, but I'd just love to see the ecosystem expand over time. As for testing the range of these devices, I decided against any scientific testing, so I didn't walk 100 meters in one direction and see if it was still transmitting. I decided to just use it in real-world testing for a couple of months and see how I fared. So I use this both outdoors and indoors, and in some environments where there's not many other electronic devices, and also in devices where there's a whole bunch of phones, iPads, and other wireless devices, so there'd be a whole bunch of signals bouncing around the room, and no matter what environment I was in, I never had a problem. Now, I wasn't trying to push it to the limits. Generally speaking, I'm running the monitor 5 to 10 meters from the camera itself, and at most there'd be one wall of varying materials. So it wasn't a huge stress test, but in all real world situations, it always worked perfectly and I never had a problem with it. And now for the latency test. So all tests were done at 4K 25 frames a second, so each frame represents about 40 milliseconds. For our first test, we used a SmallHD monitor plugged into the FX3. This showed that the internal monitor on the FX3 has a 2-frame delay, and there doesn't appear to be any additional delay from the FX3 HDMI output or the SmallHD input. Next up is the Hollyland M1 monitor. As you can see, it's got an additional 2-frame or 80 millisecond delay compared to what's showing on the internal FX3 monitor. This matches up with the laggy feeling I experienced when I was first testing the monitor. Next, I tried out the M1 on my Fujifilm X-H2. Now, the internal screen seems to have a shorter delay than the Sony's, where it seems to vary between 0 and 2 frames. However, the M1 had a total delay of 5 frames, so it seems like the HDMI output of the Fujifilm might be slightly behind what it's showing on the internal screen. Next, I tested out the SDI input using my FX6. Now, the FX6 seems to have a 2-frame delay on the internal monitor, and the M1 appeared to have a 2 to 3 frame additional delay. When transmitting to a hardware receiver, there's an additional 2-frame delay for a total of 6 or 7 frames of delay. I wanted to see if there was any additional delay if you were running multiple receivers, so I used an iPhone and a Mars 400S Pro. The 400S Pro appeared to have a 2-frame delay, but surprisingly the iPhone seemed to show the exact same thing the M1 monitor was showing. There was no additional latency by using an iPhone as a receiver compared to what you were seeing on the M1 itself. Next, I tried just using the iPhone as a receiver. So you still have the 2-frame delay on what the M1's showing you, but there's no additional delay transmitting that to the iPhone, and it was showing exactly what the M1 was showing at the same time. My final test was using the M1 as a receiver, so I had a Mars 400S Pro mounted on my FX3 as a transmitter. Now, this was set in balance mode. You can also set it to speed mode or high quality mode. I noticed a 12-frame delay compared to what I was seeing on the internal monitor. So this is totally fine for a client monitor, or if I'm trying to monitor what my second shooter is doing, but this would be completely unusable for focus pulling. After lots of time using both systems, I much prefer having a hardware receiver plugged into an external monitor over having like an iPad, iPhone, or Android app doing the receiving and monitoring there. This is for a couple of reasons. The first is repeatability. So I can have my external monitor running with the receiver and just turn everything off and then come back an hour later, turn it all back on, and it's instantly up and running. I don't need to reconnect to any wireless networks, open any apps or anything like that. It all just works instantly and it's super reliable, and I've never had any problems with it. In comparison, using a smartphone or an iPad, as soon as you turn the transmitter off, the iPad will jump back to another network, perhaps your home network, the office network, or your personal hotspot, and it won't automatically jump back. So it means if I turn the transmitter off and then back on, my iPad's lost the connection until I go into settings and reconnect it to the Wi-Fi network. The second downside of using a smartphone for external monitoring is that when you first start it up, it's just as bright as the external monitor and the images look comparable. However, after 10 minutes, the phone really starts heating up, and so it starts dimming the brightness, so that way it doesn't overheat. So then you've got a really dim iPhone compared to a perfectly bright external monitor that's just as bright as when you first turned it on. So you're also chewing through battery life, and you're getting a dimmer image, and you've got to mess around with Wi-Fi networks, and all of this just takes up time for a worse end result than you get if you were just running an external monitor. Now, neither of these complaints are unique to the Hollyland app. Previously, I tried out the Monitor Plus app, and that works really well for connecting directly to a Sony FX3, so you can remotely monitor using your iPhone or iPad, but it was the same problems. The image would just dim, and as soon as I turned the camera off for 2 seconds to swap a battery or just to take a quick break, I'd have to repair everything again, rather than just turning it on and getting back to work. So these are definitely more cost-effective options using these apps, but they really don't compare to using an external monitor, in my opinion, even though you are paying a lot more for that privilege. In conclusion, I think this is a great option if you're looking for a 5-inch monitor that can also transmit or receive video. The image quality is surprisingly good, given that it's Hollyland's first monitor ever, and it easily compares to the Shinobi and some of the SmallHD monitors. Now, the tools aren't quite as good as the SmallHD monitors, but it's more than enough. You can import custom lights, you can get your grids, you can anamorphic de-squeeze, and realistically it does everything you need. I also love how reliable the wireless video transmission is. Whenever I've got these things paired up, I just turn on the monitor, turn on the receiver, and everything would just work within a couple of seconds. I don't need to pair any devices or do anything like that. If you're looking for a 5-inch monitor with great image quality and wireless video transmission, I'd highly recommend this monitor. However, if you don't need the wireless video transmission, I'd suggest going with the Atomos Shinobi instead. It seems almost exactly like this, except a little bit worse. The image quality is just slightly worse. The build quality seems slightly lower, but it's literally half the price, and it weighs way less, and it uses a third of the power. So it's definitely a good alternative for this if you don't need the wireless video transmission. Alternatively, if you'd like the most advanced tools and the most customizability, I'd suggest going with the SmallHD monitors. It's just like this with even slightly better image quality, but the customizability of the tools is just second to none. You can go in and customize everything, put any tool wherever you want it, and just everything's so much more powerful, as well as you can have multiple pages. So you can have an anamorphic de-squeeze page, swap over to an audio page, swap over to false color, and have each one set up exactly how you want it, rather than just toggling individual tools on and off. Having said that, the M1 has found a new home permanently attached to my FX3. It's the perfect size for an FX3 rig and works really well with the DC input, allowing me to make this perfectly balanced rigged with a battery at the back here. I've made a separate video on that. If you have any questions about the M1 monitor, leave that in the comments below. Otherwise, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.